welcome to the Here For You podcast. In today's episode, we start a mini-series exploring the different models of therapy, their application, their origin, and giving everybody a brief introduction to the various different types of models that exist within the contemporary world of therapy and psychotherapy. Today's episode will be looking at psychodynamic therapy, and in later episodes of this mini-series we'll be exploring person-centered therapy, other humanistic approaches, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a few others as well. Okay, so today's episode is focused on psychodynamic therapy, and I think it makes sense to start with this one as it's really the sort of birthplace of psychotherapy in general and counselling in general, in the idea that psychodynamic therapy is what psychoanalysis, traditional sort of psychoanalysis, which is the first type of psychotherapy, kind of evolved into. People still practice psychoanalysis in its traditional form, but I think it's fair to say that psychoanalysis is probably best situated as under the umbrella of psychodynamic therapy more broadly. So psychoanalysis starts with Sigmund Freud, who originated the methods and the way of engaging in this way of working with people in the sort of late 19th and early 20th century. He's wrote extensively and very, very well on the topic of psychoanalysis. And yeah, so it starts with Freud, and as a sort of brief idea about what that is, psychoanalysis is the idea that unconscious mental processes dominate human relation and human behavior. It's considered to be key to understanding both rational and seemingly irrational behavior, and the idea that we could understand these unconscious mental processes through manifestations such as slips of the tongue, dreams, jokes, etc. In traditional sort of psychoanalysis, this formed a large part of the work involved, in which people would analyze these types of things, slips of meanings, free association, jokes, dreams, and try to interpret the unconscious meaning that was manifest within the conscious representation of symbols through people's talks and jokes, etc. Psychoanalysis was then later developed by other thinkers such as Melanie Klein and a lot of the English schools of objects relations, so Donald Winnicott and other sort of thinkers that kind of took things away from some of Freud's original drive focus ideas and looked at how people might relate to each other, so brought a much more interpersonal focus within the realm of psychoanalysis. And these days, the psychodynamic approach is more of a broad term that captures lots of different types of therapy. Some of these approaches are almost the same, or indeed exactly the same as the traditional psychoanalysis, but other approaches within the psychodynamic theory look quite different to what original psychoanalysis looked like. So it does capture quite a broad range of different approaches in the modern context. So this brings up the question, I think, of if there is such a broad range of approaches within the psychodynamic world, what makes something psychodynamic? What sets it apart from other types of therapy? So I think broadly speaking, psychodynamic theory aims to understand the role of interpersonal relationships upon intrapersonal functioning. So this means that psychodynamic approaches really focus on the role of how various interpersonal relationships, either current or past relationships through significant others and caregivers, have impacted upon the intra-functioning, psychic functioning. So that's the way in which people process emotions and understand themselves. That's one way in which I think all psychodynamic approaches hold similarity. And another sort of key aspect that makes psychodynamic is that the process in which help is achieved or distress is managed is often through the process of making the unconscious conscious. So the idea of making unconscious processes more conscious to the person through the therapy, through interpretation, as well as, I think, things that separate the psychodynamic approach from other approaches will be stuff like therapeutic stance, some of the particular methods and techniques that are involved, which we'll shortly get into. Okay, so with the therapeutic stance of the psychodynamic approach very broadly, this is often considered to be a neutral stance. So the therapist is typically considered to be a blank slate, is typically considered to be non-judgmental. So within a lot of psychodynamic approaches, the therapist will take a stance where they won't bring themselves too much into the room. And this does vary somewhat between certain approaches, but more often than not within a psychodynamic frame or model, there'd be an emphasis on the therapist being quite neutral within the space. And this would obviously involve very little or no self-disclosure from the therapist about their existence. There's often quite a lot of sitting in silences, so the use of silence within the room, the therapist not breaking the silence, allowing the client to sit in the silence and process the time in that silence, and that not being interrupted by the therapist. Often as well, the therapeutic stance within psychodynamic therapy will have a focus on bringing material back to the patient. So if the patient or the client were to ask questions about questions to the therapist or ask questions about the therapy, a typical psychodynamic stance would be to inquire as to why the client is asking that question and sort of bring it back to the client and use that to further analyze possible unconscious mechanisms that may be being played out within their need to ask a question. Also, the stance within psychodynamic therapy is used to understand meaning, and everything is sort of attributed to have a meaning within a therapy space, within a stance. So things like, as we mentioned, questions that are asked, they're considered to be meaningful. The time that somebody comes into a session, also the time of the session, is considered to be meaningful. Things related to the setting, everything really is considered to hold some sort of meaning within the therapeutic space. And I think this can often lead to practitioners in the psychodynamic, not universally, but often practitioners holding a real importance of a space being consistent, so the space not changing, the time not changing, and that being consistent throughout the course of somebody's engagement with therapy, perhaps to a much greater degree than a lot of other therapeutic approaches would place on those things. A big aspect of psychodynamic therapy is the idea of transference. So transference is described as feelings from previous relationships in the client's life that are transferred onto the therapist through a sort of unconscious process. And psychodynamic theory and therapy has a huge emphasis in managing and interpreting the transference, and considers this to be really essential to the progress of therapy. Some theorists even go as far as to say that this is sort of the key aspect of any therapeutic engagement, is really the management and interpretation of the transference material. So the therapist is trying to manage that experience of having material and emotion from previous relationships being transferred onto them as a therapist. And it's important to say that this isn't just within the sort of one-to-one therapy space, but transference should also be considered within the context of supervision. So that's the context of therapists having supervision with a colleague or even in a group. Transference is also typically considered within the context of a clinical team, and sometimes even within the context of an organization. People will think about how transference is being played out on an organizational level or within the context of a clinical team, depending on the setting in which psychodynamic therapy is being used. Another key concept or idea within psychodynamic therapy, very related to transference, is countertransference. And countertransference is slightly trickier to understand, I think, than transference. There's various definitions that have been put forward, and people lean into some of these more than others. So two very broad definitions of countertransference. One is simply the therapist's experience of the transference. So countertransference, in one definition, is simply a therapist's experience of the transference happening to them within the context of the therapeutic relationship. Another definition that is a bit broader than that previous one is that countertransference is the entirety of the therapist's feelings towards the patient. So not only how the therapist feels and interprets and experiences the transference of the client, but also all of that therapist's feelings about that client, not just based off of transference, but just collectively. Different theorists and different psychodynamic approaches will emphasize the importance of either or definition or both. The patient attempts to impose a role on the therapist within the countertransference relationship. That's often how it's sort of framed within psychodynamic therapy, that the client gets into a mode of understanding and wants the therapist to play that out with them. And the idea therapeutically, according to the psychodynamic approach, of how to work with countertransference is that ideally the therapist responds to this and hopefully is able to reflect and bring attention to what is happening within the therapeutic encounter. And the idea is that this is useful for the client in understanding how they may be interacting with other people in their lives, as well as being able to work through some of the more challenging material within the context of the therapeutic relationship. Another key concept within psychodynamic therapy is the idea of defense mechanisms. So defense mechanisms I think defense mechanisms is an interesting concept in the idea that this is one of the many examples of how traditional sort of psychoanalytic language used by Freud or coined by Freud has become used in everyday usage. It's become a very common word that people say without any sort of psychological background. And I think that's a testament really to how wide-read Freud has been and how widely impactful his ideas have been, even if these days we don't necessarily fully support everything that he said and everything that he wrote about. It was over 100 years ago, a lot of what he was saying. But I think defense mechanisms is one of these key ideas of something that was originally used specifically just within therapy, but has become a much wider idea and a much wider used. But defense mechanisms within the psychodynamic context often defined as a sort of psychological maneuver which reduces internal conflict. So it's aimed at it's a psychological mechanism that aims to reduce that sort of conflict, but to also reduce tension, regulate self-esteem, and sort of manage anxiety as well. Defense mechanisms exist for a reason and are not necessarily pathological and not necessarily negative as well. And I think that's sometimes where the usage of defense mechanisms in the context of psychodynamic theory and the use of defense mechanisms within everyday parlance, I guess, it can sometimes diverge, I think, is at least what I find. People can sometimes use defense mechanisms as a wholly negative term within everyday use. That's the idea of somebody being defensive or somebody engaging in a defensive mechanism. But within psychodynamic theory and therapy, it's not considered to be necessarily negative. In fact, actually, psychodynamic therapy would say that everybody has defense mechanisms. Everybody engages with that to some extent. That's just a consequence of being a human being. And more to that point, defense mechanisms are often divided into three different tiers, you could say, of levels of defense mechanisms. And some of the language reflects the time in which this was theorized. So really take the language with a pinch of salt. I think if somebody were to come up with these theories today, they might call these things something different. But these three levels of defense mechanisms are often sort of termed primitive, neurotic, and mature. And I think a good way to conceptualize these different layers or levels of defense mechanisms is sort of as a spectrum, with primitive defense mechanisms typically considered to be the most maladaptive, the most sort of negatively impactful on an individual and the people around them, and neurotic being somewhere sort of in the middle, and mature being typically considered to be the least maladaptive, to use psychodynamic language, but the least impactful. So as an example of a mature defense mechanism, something like altruism is typically considered to be a mature defense mechanism, which is the idea that people helping each other for seemingly altruistic ways. The psychodynamic approach may consider altruistic behavior to be, or would consider altruistic behavior to be, a defense mechanism, but not in a negative way, not as like a negative thing that somebody's doing, but just that it's a defense mechanism, but it serves a really useful function both for the individual and for the people in their life or wider society. So yeah, just the idea of, I guess, reclaiming defense mechanisms as not wholly negative, and actually in some ways quite useful and pro-social even. A sort of last key aspect that I'll explore about the psychodynamic theory and therapy is the concept of containment. So the therapist in psychodynamic therapy is often considered to be a container for the patient's emotions. So this means that the therapist is able to hold and help the patient to regulate very, very difficult and chaotic emotions for them. And the process that psychodynamic theory and therapy identifies containment in starting in is the idea that the infant often projects into the mother painful feelings. The mother processes and detoxifies these feelings, and over time the infant is able to carry out the function for him or herself. And again, I think that just kind of gives a flavor of the type of language that's used within psychodynamic therapy, where a lot of the original literature will evolve around sort of particularly mother-infant rather than necessarily like a primary caregiver, although I think the transition to primary caregiver works perfectly well in this context. So the idea is that in an ideal context, an infant will grow up where their emotions, painful emotions, are yes, probably projected onto a primary caregiver, but that primary caregiver is able to hold and contain those emotions for that infant repeatedly in a way that allows that infant to learn how to carry out that function for themselves, and the ability to contain their emotions for themselves and be able to process them after having that modeled and held for them. Where this relates to psychodynamic therapy in particular is that it sort of frames the idea that if this isn't present within early childhood, this ideal sort of containing relationship between a primary caregiver and an infant, that this is one of the mechanisms that leads to psychological distress later in life. And with this in mind, and why containment is so important as a psychodynamic concept, is that the therapist is aiming to offer a somewhat corrective relationship to develop these emotional regulation skills. So the therapist is trying to offer a containing relationship to correct that missing earlier experience. So that's just some of the key concepts of psychodynamic therapy. There are arguably a lot more, and it's a very complicated and complex series of different theories, but I just wanted to introduce some of the broad concepts and what I consider to be really the kind of key aspects that make all psychodynamic approaches psychodynamic. And just to reiterate those, I would say that the sort of core aspects would be the therapeutic stance, transference, countertransference, defense mechanisms, and containment. Okay, so that's some of the core concepts and methods within psychodynamic therapy. Just exploring some of the critiques, and there has been a lot of critiques of psychodynamic therapy and a lot of critiques of psychoanalytic therapy in particular. People have wrote multiple books, very eminent philosophers and therapists have really spent a lot of time critiquing psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approaches. I won't get into all of that here. I'll just introduce some of the broad critiques that have been out there. But this is just to say that anybody who is interested in further reading, there's a lot out there, and a lot of very intelligent and very well formulated critiques, as well as a lot of intelligent and very well formulated counterpoints to those critiques. So yeah, definitely look into those if you're interested. And maybe a good place to start is some of the critiques that I'll now point to as a starting point to bounce off to further ideas. So one of the biggest critiques of psychodynamic therapy is that historically it's had a really quite poor evidence base. And there's lots of complex reasons for this. One of the arguments about the evidence base is that actually a lot of the concepts within psychodynamic theory and therapy are very, very hard to evidence in practice. The nature of working pretty much exclusively with the unconscious is that the unconscious is something that is not conscious. So very, very hard to measure such a thing. And that's often an argument that's presented by psychodynamic practitioners, psychodynamic theorists, to the charge against them of having such a sort of poor evidence base. There has been some more recent studies that have looked into psychodynamic therapy and shown that it can be effective in certain populations. But again, I think also the critique of psychodynamic therapy as a poor evidence base probably speaks more broadly as well to some of the challenges of evidence basing therapeutic approaches, and perhaps the types of evidence gathering that is valued and what types of approaches fit more neatly within that. I'll perhaps say a little bit more about that in future episodes of the podcast. But I do think it's fair to say that psychodynamic psychotherapy probably has the biggest challenges of providing a adequate evidence base to back up some aspects of its theory. Another critique that's often leveled against psychodynamic theory and therapy is that the interventions are frequently really quite intense and long-term. And this has implications for dependency within therapy, but also on financial exploitation, possibly, of clients. It also has implications for how this type of therapy works within a health service, particularly one that is government subsidized. If the intervention is long term and very, very intense, is that something that is practical for everybody who is seeking a solution to some of their challenges. There is exceptions to this within the psychodynamic umbrella. Some specific types of psychodynamic approaches have worked to be briefer, to be much more sort of short term and much more solution focused, and have worked quite well within healthcare services as well. But as an example, traditional psychoanalysis would have been something like 3 to 5 sessions a week over the course of many years. I think another critique that's put against psychodynamic therapy is often, I guess, very broadly, the sort of strangeness of some of the concepts and some of the datedness of the language. So things like penis envy, and particularly within aspects of object relations, the idea of the baby's associations with what's called good breast, bad breast, and how the baby learns to associate the mother with the breasts. And these are often taken to be, criticisms of the approach, of the strangeness of some of those ideas, and the level of complexity that's required to explain what is meant by those. Penis envy in itself is something that has faced quite a lot of criticism in modern times. Freud came up with the idea of penis envy, and sort of just to very briefly describe what that is, that's the idea that all women envy the penis, and envy men having a penis, and want to have one themselves. And one of the biggest critiques of this was actually a sort of contemporary, or not maybe slightly later than contemporary of Freud, who Karen Horney, who argued that argued against Freud's idea of the penis envy. Said, no, women don't envy the object of a penis. What they envy is the social status that a penis provides men with, and the power within a patriarchal society that represents. And she also went a step further to say that, if anything, men have womb envy, which is what she used to describe the destructive nature of men due to the fact that they envy the womb and envy women's ability to give life. So men will try to destroy life through a process of envy, because they will never be able to give life. There's likely critiques of that theory as well, but on a personal level, I'm probably more inclined to say that holds slightly more merit than the concept of penis envy. Anyway, that's just to sort of briefly describe some of the complexities within the concepts of psychodynamic therapy, and some of the strangeness, at least to modern ears, I think, of some of the language and ideas behind some of these concepts. Yes, so that's just very briefly psychodynamic therapy as a whole, and some of the critiques of it. Like I said, there is a whole lot more critiques and a whole lot more to psychodynamic therapy than what I've been able to provide in this half an hour talk today. But I hope I have provided a good sort of introduction and summary to what makes psychodynamic therapy psychodynamic. Coming up in future episodes of the podcast, other aspects of, or other types of therapeutic models which we'll be exploring. Thank you for listening today. If you'd like to support the show, please head over to Patreon or buy me a coffee. And please do like the podcast, share it with others who you think might be interested. Thank you for listening today, and look forward to seeing you on the podcast soon. Thank you, and bye now.